Hey, I'm Brandon Cross here, and welcome to another whiteboard presentation from Node. It's been a little while since I've done one of these, and we've got a brand new office, a whole new whiteboard, and new setup for us. I've had a lot of requests to do another whiteboard talk, so here I am today. It's been a little while, and I hope that I can bring more of these to you now that I've got a new facility and it's set up and ready to go. So today I want to talk about the pros and cons of Linux versus Microsoft. And so this is a topic that a lot of people have really been struggling with lately. How do you, when do you sell Linux-based solutions versus Microsoft? So I think that there's a couple of real simple points just to know about both of them. And with those points, you probably can have an easier time assessing which one of those choices is going to be good for you. Different situations require different systems. And a lot of situations are similar to each other, so they require similar systems. Knowing the right choice to make and being able to deliver that choice is the difference between a company that has a solution they can sell and a company that's going to get skunked. So here we have the Microsoft versus Linux, couple of points that I want to make. My first point is neither one of these platforms is right for all situations and circumstances. Linux has huge failings and is not ready for everyone to use. Microsoft has giant shortcomings and will totally bite you if you put it in the wrong place and situation. It depends on your objectives as well, determines your choice here. If your objective is to build a really big giant system that's going to be handling billions of dollars of transactions and things like that, then you need to be careful about what choice you make here. If you're going to go Linux, you're going to have to build it a very certain way. And you're going to have to put a lot of investment into programmers and into coding. And the people that end up building that solution on Linux for you are going to become increasingly important for the long term of the company. But it's going to be a really unique, custom sort of thing. So that's one way to go. Whereas the same company with the same problem choosing to run on Microsoft might pay tons of money up front in licensing. Might have to pay Oracle and Microsoft consultants and EMC and all these different people all this money to bring together a solution that runs, and then they might have to pay various vendors maintenance on that. Totally different system, totally different approach. Built completely two different ways, both accomplishing the same goal with, let's say, the same situation. They're both pushing billions of dollars of transactions and stuff out. Okay, great. But, how does that help the small guys, all of us day-to-day normal people that aren't making decisions like, like Bill Gates has made his entire life? Well, for us, really, there's a couple things you have to consider. The pros of Microsoft can be started and summarized in 4 basic points here. It is a very popular platform. Popularity is good. That means that lots of people are using it. It's stable. It's effective. It's well integrated into the marketplace. Okay? It's easy to support. There's tons of people out there that support Microsoft. There's lots of guys that can do it. Finding support for a Microsoft-driven solution is easier than if you have a Linux-driven solution. It's just really, there's no two ways about it. Microsoft is very flexible. Now that flexibility comes into play as much as your software. So there's a lot of people load a lot more things onto Microsoft systems. Many guys buy one server, drop all the applications on it, set up a backup system and walk away. On Linux, you're going to be building appliances that are purpose-built, purpose-driven. You're just going to go about building that differently. Okay, there's a diverse software pool of boxed solutions for Microsoft. This is real important because when you want to go and do something and get something accomplished, you don't want to be like, okay, how do I invent a wheel here? You want to just go out and say, what do I need to accomplish this with? Okay, get it. Slap it in there, bring it together, good to go, moving on, right? That's the Microsoft world. It's just get it in here, there's something to solve this thing, throw it down, plug it up, let's go, okay? Pay a vendor to support it, good to go. All right, so that's the Microsoft world. Now you look at the pros on the Linux side. Linux is open source. That means that there can be less upfront costs for Linux. Now, some people think all things Linux means lower cost. That is something that couldn't be further from the truth. The reason why I say that is because to build a solution on Linux can take a substantial amount of effort from the people building the solution. The software that you buy for Linux may or may not work together with other software you need to combine to build your overall solution. So that can take a lot of time. Building things on Linux makes more sense when you're building the thing, when you're writing custom code, writing Ruby and Python and PHP scripts, where you want to use open source languages and open source programming tools versus having to pay a lot of money to for the, I know it used to be, to get the MSDN visual, the Visual Basic integrator and all this stuff from Microsoft. There were costs for these things, and there's a barrier to writing code on Microsoft-based systems versus open source. There's a cost barrier. For open source, you can grab a couple of guys that learned how to code on the street, throw them together, drop some software to them, give them some tools and platforms, and they can build the whole thing. Well, sounds good in theory, right? If you're great at managing those kinds of people, and if you know what you're doing, it is great in theory. If you're just going to go grab a couple guys off the street, slap them together, and tell them, build my solution on Linux, then you're going to be putting yourself in handcuffs and not even knowing it. You're going to be setting yourself up for having to solve other problems later and not knowing how to go about doing that. So, Microsoft offers some protection from that, but Linux gives you greater flexibility, I think, more and lower entry costs. So, people that want to build a solution from the ground up and know how to do the coding or have access to people that can do the coding will benefit by building it on Linux many times versus Microsoft. If you have a budget and you just want to buy a solution, then building it on Linux may or may not be the best way to go. Buying it from a Microsoft-based driven platform could be beneficial for simplicity purposes. So there's different reasons for doing different things. Now, Linux has a lot of stability once it's set up. The barrier to getting to the stability, though, comes in the cons of Linux. So Linux is highly customizable, can be very stable, has a lower entry cost, and it's an open source model. So you have access to all these code bases that all these people have provided, and the code bases are open source. So you can just grab them and plug them into your systems and use them. And unless you're reselling that code and making money on it, there's usually not giant licensing problems you have to worry about. I'd go read the GNU, the open source licensing model to get the legalese and the rules and regs of all that. But realistically, open source software gives people a lower barrier to get things started. So a lot of times small little things can get started by building on open source based solutions instead of paying tons of money up front for a Microsoft driven choice, which will cost, let's say, could cost $10,000 to start something with a Microsoft driven solution that you could have started for a couple $100 and some hardware on a Linux-based solution. So there's some reasons to consider using both in different situations. Linux can be a little complex to set up. It's not designed to be super user-friendly. I think it's very user-friendly. I mean, I get in there and go through Linux all day long, sit in putty shells and just watch all kinds of things happening in Linux and bang out lines of commands to it all day long. But that's not everybody. I don't know a lot of people that I can go to personally and say, hey, yeah, do you know how to do this crazy Linux thing over here or over there? I just don't know a lot of them. I know some, but not as many as I know Microsoft guys. The other thing is, of course, limited software choices. So when we have a limitation in our software, and the choices that we get to pick from are not as just diverse as Microsoft's choices would be, then how do we build that? Well, sometimes we have to build custom solutions. Sometimes we have to take, in Linux, you might have to take one piece of software and another piece of software and try to get them to work together, but the version of Linux that this one runs on good and the version of Linux this one runs on good are two different versions. So it's like you gotta somehow get them lined up, and you've just got to do this over and over and over again to all these different pieces of software and make them all line up and work right. And then when one of them has a security vulnerability or an update, you can apply that, and it might mess up everything. So building in Linux isn't necessarily easier and user-friendly. It can be very complicated because of those reasons. Whereas in Microsoft, all software pretty much works together in certain standard ways. So you don't run into, except in cases where it's like, the only thing I can compare this to would be in Microsoft, if you have Server 08 and a product that only runs on Server 03 and requires certain versions of .NET framework in Server 03, and another piece of software that only runs on Server 08 and requires certain .ASP and .NET frameworks that run at a different level, and these two programs have to communicate together and run together on the same platform or in the same network happily, then you have to have two separate systems for that. So you break them out. One server for this app, one server for that app, and then there's a communication channel between the two. In Microsoft, you're going to have to pay a lot more in licensing for that. Every one of those environments has to have a licensed Microsoft server instance. In Linux, that license is free. In Microsoft, it's lots of money. Okay, so when we look at the cons of Microsoft, it gets into expensive software licensing is one of the biggest cons. People complain about that a lot. Man, why does this software cost so much? Well, why is Microsoft worth so much? Security flaws heavily exploited. Since everybody uses Microsoft, everybody exploits it. Simple as that. If everybody used Apple, everybody would exploit it. And they would find exploits. There's no way, unless you're getting your code straight from God, that you can get perfect code. Review, it requires lots of computer power. Microsoft is power hungry. It is not the most efficient thing to run in the world. It requires bigger CPUs for the databases. It requires more memory, more disk space. Linux-based solutions will run on less and provide the same, you can do something just as fast in Linux many times as you can in Microsoft with less power behind it in Linux than in Microsoft because of the overhead. So all of the graphical user interface tools that make this manageable and usable for people, all of that stuff has an overhead cost. In Linux, a lot of that stuff is just kind of gotten rid of, and they say, hey, you know what? If you're not comfortable banging away at a command line, then don't use it. Yeah, if you're trying to do IT stuff, I highly encourage you get very comfortable on a command line because more is coming on the command line, and even Microsoft is starting to pull pieces of their GUI out and focus on delivering a more streamlined version that can compete with Linux's power versus the power requirements of Linux being a little bit less. Now, of course, if you're pushing millions or billions of transactions through giant databases and stuff like that, you're going to have lots of power either way. So there's a point where this argument kind of gets cut off. But at the low end, if you're going to set up a simple web server, a LAMP stack running Apache and MySQL will push a website that is a simple little brochure site for a company, and it'll push that site at the same speed that a computer running IIS and Microsoft Server 2003 or 2008 would, but that Microsoft server would require all these licensing costs and all this computer hardware and overhead, whereas the Linux web server wouldn't require any of that. So there's advantages and disadvantages there. It just depends on what you're trying to accomplish. that's the pros and cons of Microsoft versus Linux. I certainly won't stand here and say one is better than the other. They both are very important. I think that the key is to use Linux as appliances that solve purpose-driven problems, and Microsoft as a business appliance for your business management software or line of business applications that drive your company's processes and maybe integrate into some of these Linux appliances over here. A combination of both of these systems that work together to drive a business forward, I think, is better than one or the other individually, except in certain situations and different circumstances. Those are up to you to figure out. I'd encourage you to explore Linux and learn and understand it much more so, as much as Microsoft, because they're both vital and important platforms. So just look at them, get comfortable with them. Linux is here to stay. Microsoft isn't going anywhere either, and they're both being driven forward and being coalesced together into more and more systems fluidly and dynamically